AI, true crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crimes are real.
Chapter 1, Origins. Elizabeth Holmes was born on February 3, 1984, in Washington, D.C., into a family that valued status, ambition, and public service. Her father, Christian Holmes IV, worked in government agencies including USAID, and her mother, Noel Holmes, served as a congressional staffer. The family lineage included figures who had held positions in finance and federal service. That heritage mattered to Holmes. Former classmates would later recall that she spoke openly, even as a teenager, about wanting to become a billionaire and to change the world. Holmes attended St. John's School in Houston, Texas, after her family relocated. Teachers described her as serious and intensely driven. She excelled in academics, particularly in science and mathematics, but she also displayed an early fascination with entrepreneurship. As a high school student, she studied Mandarin and reportedly told classmates she wanted to build a career in global business. During summers, she attended Stanford University's Mandarin program and later claimed to have worked in laboratories in Singapore, an experience she said introduced her to blood testing technologies. In 2002, at age 18, Holmes enrolled at Stanford University to study chemical engineering. She worked in the laboratory of Professor Channing Robertson, a respected engineering faculty member who would later become one of her earliest supporters. According to accounts presented at trial, Holmes was deeply interested in microfluidics, the manipulation of very small volumes of liquids, and in drug delivery systems using wearable patches. In 2003, after her freshman year, Holmes filed a provisional patent application for a wearable drug delivery patch that could adjust medication levels based on blood chemistry. The concept was ambitious and, according to later testimony, not fully developed. That same year, she approached Professor Robertson with an idea that would become the seed of Theranos, a device capable of running multiple diagnostic tests on a small sample of blood obtained from a finger stick rather than a venous straw. Holmes left Stanford in the fall of 2003, at 19, to pursue the company full-time. Robertson joined the board and became a vocal advocate. Holmes began raising seed funding from family connections and Silicon Valley investors. Early backers included venture capitalist Tim Draper, whose family had long-standing ties to the Holmes family. The company was initially named Real-Time Cures before being rebranded as Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. From the beginning, Holmes crafted a narrative that blended personal conviction with technological disruption. She described a fear of needles and a desire to make testing less painful. She framed the company's mission in moral terms: early detection of disease, democratized access to diagnostics, empowerment of patients. Investors were drawn not only to the potential market but to Holmes herself. Tall, poised, and soft-spoken, she adopted a uniform of black turtlenecks that echoed Steve Jobs. Over time, her voice deepened noticeably in public appearances, a detail that would later attract scrutiny. By 2004, Holmes had raised her first $1 million. By 2005, funding had grown to several million more. Theranos operated in relative secrecy, declining to publish peer-reviewed studies or share detailed technical data. Holmes argued that stealth was necessary to protect intellectual property. In Silicon Valley's culture of bold startups, that explanation was not unusual. Yet even in these early years, internal challenges were evident. Engineers struggled to miniaturize existing laboratory processes into a compact device. Blood behaves differently at micro-volumes. Reagents degrade. Calibration becomes more complex. The scientific hurdles were significant, and the timeline Holmes presented to investors was aggressive. Still, by the late 2000s, Theranos had secured tens of millions of dollars in venture capital. Holmes had built a board populated not by medical researchers but by prominent political and military figures, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and former Secretary of Defense George Shultz. Their presence lent credibility, even though few had expertise in laboratory science. Holmes's early life reveals a consistent pattern: ambition framed as destiny, confidence presented as certainty, and a willingness to move quickly through technical obstacles. By her mid-20s, she was no longer a promising student with an idea. She was the chief executive of a fast-growing private company valued in the hundreds of millions, promising to transform medicine with a single drop of blood. This is AI True Crime, and this week, we're looking at Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. Chapter 2, Assembling the Vision, 2004 to 2010. By 2004, Elizabeth Holmes was no longer simply a Stanford dropout with a patent application. She was the chief executive of a privately funded startup operating out of Palo Alto, California, determined to build a machine that could compress an entire clinical laboratory into a box small enough to sit on a countertop. Theranos' early headquarters were modest, but the ambition was not. Holmes recruited engineers, chemists, and software developers, many of them young and drawn by the promise of solving a monumental problem. The company's initial goal was to create a device that could run dozens, eventually hundreds, of blood tests from a few drops obtained through a finger stick. Internally, prototypes were developed under evolving code names. Eventually, the central device would be called Edison. The science behind traditional blood testing is complex. Standard hospital laboratories rely on large analyzers, carefully calibrated reagents, and venous blood draws that provide sufficient volume to minimize error. Holmes's concept required shrinking those processes dramatically. Microfluidics, the movement of tiny volumes of liquid through small channels, was a key component. But blood is not a simple fluid. It clots, separates, and reacts to temperature and time. Running multiple assays on minute samples required precision at a scale that magnified even small deviations. In these early years, Theranos operated in extreme secrecy. Employees were required to sign stringent non-disclosure agreements. Teams were compartmentalized. Engineers working on hardware often had little knowledge of the chemistry team's progress. Holmes defended this structure as necessary to protect intellectual property. Critics would later argue that it prevented problems from being openly identified and addressed. Holmes also focused heavily on image and governance. Rather than building a board of directors filled with laboratory scientists, she recruited prominent statesmen. In addition to Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, the board included former Senator Sam Nunn and retired Marine Corps General James Mattis. Their reputations conveyed gravitas and credibility to investors, even though none were experts in clinical diagnostics. Funding accelerated. Between 2004 and 2010, Theranos raised tens of millions of dollars from venture capital firms and private investors. Among the early supporters was Tim Draper, whose enthusiasm for disruptive startups aligned with Holmes's pitch. As capital flowed in, the company expanded its laboratory space and invested in manufacturing capabilities for its cartridges and devices. Internally, however, technical challenges persisted. According to testimony later presented in court, early versions of the Edison device struggled with consistency. Results varied. Calibration drifted. Some assays produced inaccurate readings. Engineers cycled through redesigns, attempting to stabilize the system. Holmes maintained aggressive timelines, assuring investors that breakthroughs were imminent. By 2007 and 2008, Theranos began exploring potential partnerships beyond Silicon Valley. Holmes sought relationships with pharmaceutical companies and the U.S. military, presenting the technology as portable and deployable in remote settings. Although discussions occurred, evidence later showed that the technology was not validated for battlefield use in the way some public statements suggested. In 2009, Ramesh Balwani, known as Sunny, joined the company as president and chief operating officer. Balwani had previously worked in software and had met Holmes years earlier. His arrival marked a shift in internal management. He took a hands-on role in operations and hiring, tightening oversight and, according to later employee accounts, enforcing discipline through an intimidating management style. By 2010, Theranos had grown significantly in staff and funding, yet it remained a private company that had not published peer-reviewed validation studies of its core technology. Holmes argued that secrecy was strategic. Investors accepted the explanation, in part because the broader technology culture celebrated founders who moved fast and guarded their innovations closely. At 26, Holmes was already being profiled in business publications as a rising star. The company's valuation climbed steadily as new rounds of funding closed. The central promise remained unchanged: faster, cheaper, less invasive blood testing that could transform preventive medicine. What had not yet been tested in the public arena was whether the underlying science could match the scale of that promise. Chapter 3, Expansion and Elevation, 2010 to 2013. By 2010, Theranos had moved beyond the experimental phase in its own narrative. Internally, engineers continued refining the Edison device, but externally, Elizabeth Holmes was presenting the company as a near-finished revolution in laboratory medicine. In 2010 and 2011, Theranos began constructing a certified clinical laboratory in Newark, California. Rather than seek immediate approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for its devices, the company operated primarily under the regulatory framework for laboratory-developed tests. This pathway, governed in part by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services under the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments Program, allowed certain tests to be developed and performed within a single certified lab without the same level of pre-market device approval required for widely distributed diagnostic machines. Holmes described this approach as innovative efficiency. Critics would later argue it reduced external scrutiny at a critical stage. The Edison devices were placed inside Theranos' own laboratory, where tests were run on patient samples processed internally rather than shipped out to hospitals. In 2011, Theranos relocated its headquarters to a larger facility in Palo Alto, signaling growth. The board expanded, adding more high-profile figures. Media interest increased. Holmes cultivated a distinctive public persona: black turtlenecks, minimal jewelry, and a carefully modulated speaking style. Comparisons to Steve Jobs became common in business profiles. Funding rounds grew larger. By 2013, Theranos had raised hundreds of millions of dollars, pushing its valuation into the billions. Private investors included wealthy individuals and family offices rather than traditional Silicon Valley venture capital firms. Among them was Rupert Murdoch, who invested tens of millions of dollars. The company's board composition and investor list gave the impression of stability and endorsement at the highest levels. That same year marked a pivotal commercial move. Theranos announced a partnership with Walgreens to roll out blood testing services inside retail stores. The idea was simple and powerful: customers could walk into a neighborhood pharmacy, have a finger stick, and receive fast, affordable results without visiting a traditional laboratory or doctor's office. To support this expansion, Theranos needed its devices to perform reliably across a growing menu of tests. Internally, employees later testified that the Edison system was capable of running only a limited subset of assays accurately. For many other tests, Theranos relied on modified commercial analyzers from established manufacturers. Samples drawn by finger stick were diluted to meet the volume requirements of those machines. Dilution introduced variability and, in some cases, significant error. In 2013, Theranos began operating wellness centers in select Walgreens locations in Arizona. Patients paid out of pocket for blood tests without necessarily consulting physicians beforehand. The direct-to-consumer model was marketed as empowering and cost-effective. Arizona was chosen in part because state law allowed patients to order their own lab tests without a doctor's prescription. Meanwhile, Holmes's public recognition soared. In 2014, she appeared on the covers of major business magazines and was celebrated as the youngest self-made female billionaire based on Theranos' reported valuation. At age 30, she embodied the archetype of the visionary founder. Inside the company, however, turnover was increasing. Some laboratory directors and scientists raised concerns about accuracy and quality control. Emails presented later in court showed debates about validation data and device performance. According to prosecutors, Holmes was informed of limitations in the technology even as she assured investors and partners that the system was robust and proven. By the end of 2013, Theranos stood at the height of its public reputation. Retail partnerships were expanding. Capital was abundant. Holmes was a fixture at technology conferences. Yet the gap between public claims and internal performance was widening. The next phase would test whether that gap could remain hidden as real patients and regulators began to look more closely. Chapter 4, Cracks in the Facade, 2014 to early 2015. In 2014, Elizabeth Holmes stood at the apex of Silicon Valley fame. Theranos was valued at approximately $9 billion. Holmes's personal stake was reported to be worth more than $4 billion. She appeared at conferences, on magazine covers, and on television panels, describing a future in which routine blood testing would be as simple as checking an email. Behind that image, internal strain intensified. As Theranos expanded its retail presence in Arizona through its partnership with Walgreens, more patient samples flowed through its Newark, California laboratory. Scaling up exposed variability. Devices that functioned in controlled demonstrations did not always perform consistently under daily clinical demand. Employees later testified that certain assays run on the Edison platform produced erratic results. Quality control data sometimes fell outside acceptable ranges. In some cases, staff repeated tests multiple times to obtain a number that aligned more closely with expectations. The pressure to deliver accurate results quickly, especially in a consumer retail environment, was constant. Theranos executives publicly claimed that their proprietary devices could perform more than 200 different tests using a few drops of blood. Internally, according to later evidence presented at trial, only a limited subset of tests were reliably performed on Edison units. Many others were processed on traditional analyzers manufactured by companies such as Siemens Healthineers. To accommodate the smaller finger stick samples, blood was diluted before being run on those machines. Dilution can alter concentration measurements, particularly for certain hormone and electrolyte tests. Concerns surfaced within the company. In 2014, Laboratory Director Dr. Adam Rosendorf began questioning the accuracy of specific test results. He later testified that he raised issues about proficiency testing and device reliability. Emails introduced in court showed internal discussions about failed quality checks and the need to adjust reporting thresholds. The regulatory environment was becoming less forgiving. While Theranos operated under the framework of laboratory-developed tests, federal inspectors retained authority to review laboratory practices. Questions arose about how proficiency tests were conducted. Proficiency testing is designed to ensure that a lab can produce accurate results when analyzing standardized samples. According to later allegations, some proficiency samples were run on conventional analyzers rather than the Edison devices regulators believed were being evaluated. Externally, Holmes maintained unwavering confidence. In interviews during 2014, she stated that Theranos technology had been validated and was used by pharmaceutical companies and the military. Prosecutors would later argue that certain representations about military deployment were overstated. By early 2015, the first major media scrutiny emerged. Reporter John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal began contacting former employees and industry experts after receiving tips about inconsistencies in Theranos's claims. Sources described devices that malfunctioned and internal practices that diverged from public statements. As Carreyrou sought comment, Theranos responded forcefully. Company attorneys sent letters challenging the reporting and warning of legal consequences. Holmes continued to reassure investors and partners that the company's science was sound. At this stage, no criminal charges had been filed. No jury had weighed evidence. Yet the narrative was shifting. The distance between what Theranos promised and what some employees observed inside the lab was narrowing under scrutiny. The facade had not yet collapsed, but for the first time, it was under sustained external pressure. Chapter 5, Exposure, October 2015. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published the first major investigative article by John Carreyrou detailing allegations that Theranos was not using its proprietary technology for the majority of its blood tests. The article cited former employees who claimed that the Edison device could perform only a small number of assays accurately and that most patient samples were being processed on conventional laboratory machines. The report was specific. It described how Theranos had modified commercial analyzers and diluted finger stick blood samples to run tests on equipment never designed for such small volumes. It alleged that quality control results frequently fell outside acceptable ranges. It questioned whether the company had misled investors, partners, and patients about the scope and reliability of its technology. Elizabeth Holmes responded quickly. She appeared on national television, including financial news programs, and stated that the journal's reporting was wrong. She insisted that Theranos had run more than 1,000 tests comparing its technology to industry standards and that the results demonstrated accuracy. The company's legal team issued strongly worded statements accusing the newspaper of relying on disgruntled former employees. Internally, however, the impact was immediate. Employees described a tense atmosphere. Meetings were called to reassure staff. Executives framed the article as an attack on innovation. At the same time, federal regulators began reviewing the claims in detail. In late October 2015, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted an unannounced inspection of Theranos' Newark laboratory. Inspectors examined documentation, interviewed laboratory personnel, and reviewed quality control data. Their preliminary findings, later formalized in a January 2016 report, cited serious deficiencies. Among them were failures in personnel training, inadequate quality assessment procedures, and problems with equipment calibration. The report concluded that conditions in the laboratory constituted immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. That designation carries significant weight under federal law. It signals that deficiencies are severe enough to risk serious harm or death if not corrected promptly. Meanwhile, Carreyrou's reporting continued. In subsequent articles published in October and December 2015, he detailed allegations that Theranos had conducted proficiency testing on traditional analyzers while representing to regulators that its proprietary devices were being evaluated. The articles also described internal emails and testimonies suggesting that executives were aware of accuracy issues. As scrutiny intensified, Walgreens began reassessing its partnership. Walgreens had already opened dozens of Theranos wellness centers in Arizona stores, allowing customers to order blood tests without a physician's prescription under state law. Executives sought additional validation data from Theranos. According to later court filings, the information provided did not fully resolve concerns about reliability. Investors also began requesting briefings. Theranos had raised more than $700 million by this point, largely from private individuals and family offices rather than traditional venture capital firms. Many had relied heavily on Holmes's presentations and the prestige of the board, which included figures such as Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. Within weeks of the first article, the company's valuation, though not publicly traded, effectively entered free fall. New investment halted. Potential partners withdrew from negotiations. The carefully cultivated image of seamless innovation was replaced by questions about data integrity and regulatory compliance. October 2015 did not end Theranos, but it marked the moment when secrecy could no longer contain doubt. What had once been whispered inside laboratory corridors was now printed in the nation's leading financial newspaper. From that point forward, the trajectory was no longer about growth. It was about accountability. Chapter 6, Regulatory Reckoning, 2016. In January 2016, federal regulators formalized what investigative reporting had begun to expose. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services issued a detailed report on Theranos' Newark, California laboratory, citing numerous violations of the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. The findings were not minor paperwork errors. Inspectors documented failures in quality control procedures, inadequate validation of test methods, and deficiencies in personnel qualifications. One of the most significant allegations involved proficiency testing. Clinical laboratories are required to analyze standardized samples to demonstrate accuracy. According to the CMS report and subsequent federal filings, Theranos had not consistently used its proprietary Edison devices to run those samples. Instead, certain proficiency tests were processed on traditional commercial analyzers. Regulators argued that this practice undermined the purpose of the testing, which was to assess the performance of the technology actually being used on patients. The agency concluded that conditions at the laboratory posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In March 2016, CMS proposed sanctions that included revoking the lab's certification and banning Elizabeth Holmes from owning or operating a clinical laboratory for 2 years. The proposed penalties were extraordinary for a company that, only months earlier, had been celebrated as a transformative force in medicine. Theranos responded publicly, stating that it had corrected the cited deficiencies and was cooperating with regulators. Internally, the situation was more complex. In early 2016, The company voided approximately 60,000 to 80,000 blood test results conducted in 2014 and 2015. Patients received letters informing them that their prior test results had been invalidated. For some individuals, those results had informed medical decisions ranging from medication adjustments to further diagnostic procedures. The partnership with Walgreens deteriorated rapidly. In January 2016, Walgreens suspended the expansion of Theranos testing centers. By June, the pharmacy chain announced it would terminate its relationship entirely and close all Theranos wellness centers. Walgreens later filed a lawsuit seeking hundreds of millions of dollars, alleging that it had been misled about the readiness and reliability of the technology. As legal exposure mounted, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission began investigating statements made to investors. Theranos had raised more than $700 million from private investors who were told that its technology was capable of running a broad array of tests accurately and that revenue projections were strong. Federal authorities examined internal emails, board presentations, and investor pitch materials to determine whether those claims were materially misleading. During this period, Ramesh Balwani stepped down from his role as president and chief operating officer in May 2016. The company restructured its leadership and announced plans to shift focus from consumer blood testing to a smaller set of validated diagnostic products. Hundreds of employees were laid off in 2 rounds during 2016, significantly reducing staff. In July 2016, CMS formally revoked the Newark Lab certification and banned Holmes from owning or operating a laboratory for 2 years. The regulatory action effectively dismantled the core of Theranos' business model. Without a certified laboratory, the company could not legally process patient blood tests in the manner it had promised. By late 2016, the once expansive vision of retail blood testing centers had collapsed. The company attempted to pivot toward developing a miniaturized testing platform called the Mini Lab, which it demonstrated at a scientific conference. However, skepticism remained high. Validation data were limited, and confidence among partners had eroded. The year 2016 marked the transition from controversy to formal enforcement. What began as media scrutiny evolved into regulatory sanctions, civil investigations, and mounting legal risk. The gap between the company's public assurances and the documented findings of federal inspectors had become impossible to reconcile. Chapter 7, Civil Charges and Criminal Indictment, 2017 to 2018. By 2017, Theranos was no longer fighting for growth. It was fighting for survival. The laboratory that had powered its retail blood testing model had lost federal certification. Its partnership with Walgreens was terminated. Lawsuits were multiplying. The company's valuation, once reported at $9 billion, had effectively collapsed, though as a private firm it did not trade publicly. In March 2018, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed a civil fraud complaint against Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani. The complaint alleged that from 2013 through 2015, Holmes and Balwani had engaged in an elaborate, years-long scheme to defraud investors. According to the SEC, Theranos misrepresented the capabilities of its proprietary analyzer, exaggerated revenue projections, and falsely claimed that its technology was being used by the U.S. Department of Defense in combat zones. The SEC detailed specific representations made to investors. In one instance, Theranos allegedly projected hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue based on contracts that either did not exist or were far more limited than described. In another, the company circulated reports bearing the logos of pharmaceutical companies, suggesting validation or endorsement, when those companies had not formally approved the content in the way investors were led to believe. Holmes settled the SEC charges without admitting or denying the allegations. Under the terms of the settlement, she agreed to pay a $500,000 penalty, relinquish control of the company, return millions of shares, and accept a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of a public company. Balwani did not settle at that stage. The civil case was only the beginning. On June 15, 2018, a federal grand jury in the Northern District of California indicted Holmes and Balwani on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment alleged 2 parallel schemes, one to defraud investors and another to defraud patients who paid for blood tests. Wire fraud charges require proof of intentional deception using interstate communications, such as emails, phone calls, or financial transfers. Prosecutors alleged that Holmes and Balwani knowingly made false statements about the accuracy and reliability of Theranos' technology, its financial condition, and its commercial relationships. The indictment described communications with investors in which Holmes allegedly stated that Theranos devices could perform comprehensive blood testing with a high degree of accuracy. It also cited internal data that prosecutors argued contradicted those claims. The patient-related counts focused on representations made to individuals who purchased blood tests at Theranos wellness centers in Arizona. Holmes and Balwani both pleaded not guilty. Their defense team signaled that they would argue the company had struggled but had not engaged in criminal fraud. Holmes maintained publicly that she believed in the technology and never intended to deceive anyone. Meanwhile, Theranos itself announced in September 2018 that it would dissolve. The company laid off its remaining employees and began an orderly wind down of operations. Creditors were notified. Remaining assets were liquidated. What had once been a high-profile Silicon Valley disruptor effectively ceased to exist as a functioning enterprise. The transition from regulatory sanction to criminal indictment marked a decisive shift. No longer was the case about compliance failures or overly optimistic projections. It was about intent. Federal prosecutors were now asserting that the gap between Theranos' public claims and its internal reality was not a misunderstanding of innovation but a deliberate scheme. The next phase would move from filings and settlements to a courtroom, where evidence would be tested before a jury. Chapter 8, The Trial of Elizabeth Holmes, 2021 to 2022. The criminal case against Elizabeth Holmes did not proceed immediately after her June 2018 indictment. Pre-trial motions, discovery disputes, and scheduling delays stretched the timeline. Then the COVID-19 pandemic further postponed proceedings. Jury selection in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California, in San Jose, finally began in August 2021. Opening statements were delivered in September. Holmes faced 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Her former chief operating officer, Ramesh Balwani, was charged separately and would be tried in a different proceeding. Prosecutors alleged that Holmes knowingly misled investors and patients about the capabilities of Theranos' technology between 2010 and 2015. The government's case relied heavily on documents and insider testimony. Jurors were shown internal emails, investor presentations, laboratory reports, and financial projections. Former Theranos employees, including laboratory directors and scientists, testified that the Edison device struggled with accuracy and consistency. Some described being pressured to validate results or to frame data in ways that aligned with executive expectations. One key witness was former laboratory director Dr. Adam Rosendorf, who testified that he raised concerns about quality control and accuracy in 2014. Prosecutors used his testimony to argue that Holmes was informed of technical problems even as she publicly promoted the technology as reliable and validated. Investors also took the stand. Several testified that they relied on Holmes's representations when committing substantial sums, in some cases tens of millions of dollars. Evidence presented at trial included financial forecasts projecting hundreds of millions in revenue from contracts that prosecutors argued were exaggerated or non-existent. The government contended that Holmes personally approved materials that mischaracterized relationships with pharmaceutical companies and the U.S. military. Holmes's defense team pursued multiple strategies. They argued that Theranos was an ambitious startup that failed, not a criminal enterprise. According to the defense, scientific setbacks and miscalculations did not equal fraud. They also emphasized that Holmes had invested years of work into the company and had not personally profited by selling shares before the collapse. A central theme of the defense was the role of Balwani. Holmes testified in her own defense in November 2021, an uncommon and high-risk decision in federal fraud cases. On the stand, she stated that she believed in the technology and that she relied on others for certain operational details. She also alleged that Balwani had exercised controlling and emotionally abusive behavior during their personal and professional relationship. Prosecutors challenged this portrayal, arguing that Holmes remained the ultimate decision-maker and public face of the company. The trial lasted nearly 4 months. Closing arguments were delivered in December 2021. The jury deliberated for more than 50 hours over 7 days. On January 3, 2022, the jury returned a mixed verdict. Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts related to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on 4 counts tied to defrauding patients, and the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict on 3 additional counts. The distinction was significant. Jurors concluded that prosecutors had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Holmes intentionally misled investors. On the patient-related counts, the evidence did not produce unanimous agreement. The verdict underscored the complexity of the case, separating investor fraud from the broader narrative of medical harm. In November 2022, Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, followed by supervised release. The court also ordered her to pay restitution, with the exact amount to be determined in subsequent proceedings. Balwani, tried separately in 2022, was convicted on multiple counts and later sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. The trial transformed the Theranos story from a cautionary business tale into a definitive criminal judgment. Evidence that had once circulated in investigative articles and regulatory filings was now examined under oath. Emails were read aloud. Data charts were projected for jurors. Ambition, secrecy, and misrepresentation were measured against the legal standard of intent. In the end, a federal jury concluded that the line from startup optimism to fraud had been crossed. Chapter 9, Sentencing, Restitution, and Aftermath. After the January 3, 2022 verdict, the case entered its final legal phase, sentencing. In federal fraud cases, sentencing is guided by the United States Sentencing Guidelines, which consider factors such as financial loss, number of victims, and the defendant's role in the offense. Prosecutors argued that Elizabeth Holmes had orchestrated a scheme that caused hundreds of millions of dollars in losses to investors in Theranos. In court filings, the government calculated investor losses at more than $100 million attributable to the counts of conviction. The defense urged leniency, arguing that Holmes had not sought personal enrichment through stock sales before the company's collapse and that the broader valuation losses were driven by market perception rather than direct diversion of funds. Letters submitted to the court from supporters described Holmes as dedicated and idealistic. Other letters from former employees and investors emphasized the scale of the deception and the damage done. On November 18, 2022, U.S. District Judge Edward Davila sentenced Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. The sentence fell below the maximum possible term but reflected the court's finding that the fraud was serious and sustained. Holmes was also ordered to pay restitution, with the precise amount to be determined in coordination with her co-defendant, Ramesh Balwani, who had been convicted in July 2022 on 12 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. In December 2022, Balwani was sentenced to 12 years and 11 months in prison. In May 2023, a federal judge ordered Holmes and Balwani to pay approximately $452 million in restitution to investors, including substantial sums to individuals such as Rupert Murdoch. Restitution in federal cases is designed to compensate victims for direct losses tied to the crimes of conviction. Whether the full amount will be recovered remains uncertain, as both defendants' future earnings and assets will determine actual payments. Holmes reported to federal prison in May 2023 after her appeals were denied pending further review. Her case continued through the appellate courts, where defense attorneys challenged aspects of the trial, including evidentiary rulings and jury instructions. As of the time of sentencing, no court had overturned the convictions. The broader impact of the Theranos scandal extended beyond the defendants. The case prompted renewed debate about oversight of laboratory-developed tests and the regulatory gap between device approval and in-house lab operations. It also forced investors to re-examine due diligence practices. Many Theranos backers had invested based on personal trust, board prestige, and private demonstrations rather than independent scientific validation. Within Silicon Valley, the story became shorthand for unchecked founder mythology. Holmes had been celebrated in 2014 as the youngest self-made female billionaire. By 2023, she was a federal inmate. The arc was stark. Theranos itself had formally dissolved in September 2018, notifying shareholders that it would wind down operations and distribute remaining assets to creditors. Its patents and intellectual property were sold. Offices were vacated. The once secretive laboratories were dismantled. For patients who'd received inaccurate results, and for employees whose careers were disrupted, the restitution process did not fully address the personal toll. Yet the criminal convictions established a legal conclusion, that representations made to investors crossed from optimism into intentional fraud. By the time sentencing concluded, the Theranos saga had spanned nearly 2 decades, from a 2003 Stanford dropout's idea to a 2023 prison reporting date. The case stands as one of the most prominent examples of startup deception in the history of American technology, defined not only by ambition but by the legal consequences that followed when claims outpaced reality. Chapter 10: Legacy and Lessons. When Elizabeth Holmes reported to federal prison in May 2023, the legal chapter of the Theranos story entered a quieter phase. The headlines that once celebrated disruption had long since turned to conviction and restitution. What remained was the question of legacy: how a company founded in 2003 with a promise to transform medicine became a case study in criminal fraud. Theranos did not invent exaggerated startup claims, but it elevated them into the realm of healthcare, where stakes are uniquely high. Software platforms can fail and be patched. Social media networks can pivot. Blood tests inform diagnoses of cancer, heart disease, pregnancy, and metabolic disorders. When Theranos voided tens of thousands of test results in 2016, it underscored that inaccurate diagnostics are not abstract miscalculations. They are personal, and sometimes life-altering. The criminal convictions in 2022 clarified one central legal issue: intent. Federal jurors concluded that Holmes knowingly misled investors about the capabilities and readiness of the technology. That distinction separated Theranos from companies that simply failed. Failure is common in Silicon Valley. Fraud requires deception. The evidence presented in court, including internal emails and financial projections, persuaded the jury that misrepresentation was not accidental. The case also exposed structural weaknesses in oversight. Theranos operated primarily under the framework governing laboratory-developed tests, which allowed it to avoid certain layers of pre-market device approval. Regulators have since debated whether that pathway requires reform, particularly for companies introducing novel diagnostic platforms. The intersection of innovation and patient safety remains delicate. Investor culture was another focal point. Theranos raised more than $700 million without publishing peer-reviewed validation studies of its core device. Many backers were wealthy individuals rather than traditional venture capital firms with deep scientific advisory networks. The presence of prominent political figures on the board, including Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, lent prestige but not laboratory expertise. The lesson was stark: reputation does not substitute for technical scrutiny. Media scrutiny also proved decisive. The reporting of John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal in October 2015 initiated the cascade that led to regulatory action and criminal charges. Whistleblowers, many of them young scientists, provided critical information despite the risk of litigation. Without that exposure, Theranos might have continued operating longer, potentially affecting more patients and investors. For Holmes personally, the transformation was dramatic. In 2014 she was featured on magazine covers as a visionary entrepreneur. In 2022 she stood before a federal judge for sentencing. The narrative arc was often framed as a fall from grace, but the court record reframed it as accountability under federal law. Theranos is now frequently cited in business schools and compliance seminars as a warning. It illustrates how charismatic leadership, aggressive timelines, and insular corporate culture can converge to obscure fundamental technical shortcomings. It also demonstrates that in highly regulated industries, optimism cannot replace validation. The story began with a 19-year-old leaving Stanford University to build a company around a drop of blood. It ended with prison sentences, hundreds of millions in restitution orders, and a dissolved corporation. Between those endpoints lies a record of ambition, secrecy, regulatory intervention, and a jury verdict that defined the boundary between visionary risk and criminal fraud. Next time, we're looking at one of the crimes that has been in the mind of Oakland residents since it happened: the murder of Oscar Grant. This has been AI True Crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real.
AI True Crime. The intelligence intelligence is artificial, but the crime